Right. Well, kia ora, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. A warm welcome, Mayor Ash, and all councillors, to Don and to all members of staff at MPDC as well. Really pleased to join you. Would have preferred to do it in person. We were planning to do it last Wednesday, as you know, and events decided otherwise, and we had to fly back home and stuff rather quickly. I will share a screen in a minute, and Andy and I will do a double act. I'll cover the wider NDP picture, which Mayor Ash and Don have seen before in some measure, and then Andy will delve into the work we've been doing with your staff to talk about the implications for the council. You've probably gathered from now with my accent that I'm not from around here. So I'm originally from England, from Newcastle upon Tyne. It's not a farming area, it's a big industrial city. You know, one of the things you've got to do in Newcastle, you have to follow the local football team. You probably haven't heard of Newcastle United, but they've got a huge sporting following, but haven't won a trophy in 66 years. So when I got to Wellington 8 years ago, I took the family on day 2 to see the Hurricanes, and they lost. And then on day 3, the Phoenix, and they lost. And we thought to ourselves, this is our kind of town. Yeah. But anyway, I've worked in local government as a CE, in England and here in New Zealand. And I've also worked in the support services sector, supplying technology services actually to councils and government organisations. Andy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi all. Andy Matthews. I've been involved with the officers in the Bay of Plenty Waikato region in terms of getting our heads around and understanding the challenges and opportunities of Three Waters reform for 9 or 10 months now, I suppose, in terms of working through the initial sort of DIA request for information process, and so have built up a pretty good understanding of those opportunities and challenges as they exist, both in individual councils and throughout the region. As Don said, from a sheep and beef farming background originally, but then moved into local government, I suppose, about 20 years ago, and have worked in a number of organisations and from a consultancy perspective. My most recently in CFO director role, so I'd probably bring more of a finance bent than the other areas. But nice to be here and looking forward to the discussion today.
And both Andy and I have been involved in our past in amalgamations in councils. Andy with the Auckland transition, I was involved with the merger of 7 councils in Cornwall in southwest England. So know about the opportunities and the risks and problems around all of that. We're here today funded by Local Government New Zealand. We're not representing the DIA. We're not advocating water reform. The purpose of today really is to look at, I guess, the what's in it, the most important question in politics, what's in it for me? But in this case, what's in it for Matamata-Piako? And the idea is to approach that in a balanced way. There'll be some upside and there'll be some downside. It's not all roses in the garden, and it's different for each place. There are obviously a lot of common issues that come through, and there are a lot of unique issues to your area. So Andy and I will do a double act. I will cover what does the picture look like across the whole of the NDP area. That's the Bay of Plenty, the Waikato, Taranaki, and the Upper Manawatu area, 22 different councils. And then Andy's going to drill down into the information we've put together on Matamata-Piako. And there should be plenty of time for Q&A afterwards. Now, I'm a bit of a doodler, and some of you have seen these sketches. But I wanted to start off on a really positive note. We've been working with the Waikato councils and the Bay of Plenty councils for some time, and we've started working with the Upper Manawatu and Taranaki councils too. There's a really strong tradition of collaboration across the end of the area, and particularly in the Waikato. I mean, if you look at the Waikato LAS is a great example of collaborative work. And, you know, when you look at things like procurement, a relatively small council like Matamata-Piako is able to punch above its weight because it works with the other councils through the LAS in the procurement area. So that's pretty impressive. We know across the region, there's some very strong relationships with iwi, and it will be challenging given the numbers of iwi involved, as well as the number of councils. But actually there's a big opportunity in that space. There's already a strong tradition of sub-regional planning, which should help in determining the priorities for the new water entities if they happen. And there's already a lot of joint work going on in the water space in a range of areas. If you look at the Bay of Plenty, Taronga and Western Bay are working together on water services, for example. You've got Watercare working with Waikato District, and you've got some new co-governance arrangements coming into place. You know, the Hauraki Gulf Forum would be an example. So there are lots of examples across this entity area of innovation, and I think there's a lot of good foundations to build on. Now, moving on to the government's case for reform, that's supposed to be Clint Eastwood with a quotation, "Make my day." But you know the case by now. The government are saying, look, there's a big deficit. It's going to cost a lot to put right. New regulators are coming into force, which are going to be game changers. We've already got ROI up and running, and we are going to have a new economic regulator going forward as well. And I can tell you, with my British background, in the UK, if it moved, it was regulated, and it's a tough world. You had to have teams set up to deal with the regulations, and if you get it wrong and you get intervention or something like that, it could easily be a front page story in the national newspaper or on the BBC News or whatever. So it's a different world we're moving into. The government are saying to address the deficit, there needs to be a big increase in CapEx, and it will leave a lot of local authorities struggling to be able to fund other service areas without change. And then that will also mean some big increases in rates. So are the savings realistic? 45% is a very big number. Remember, they're over 30 years. So they are assuming, you know, roughly 1.5% to 2% per annum. The other thing to understand, though, is Watercare have, which is the biggest entity in New Zealand, as you know, and actually has the lowest operational two water service costs, because it doesn't have stormwater, it just does drinking water and wastewater, but they have the lowest costs in that space in the country, and they should do, because they have high density. You know, so it doesn't mean they're absolutely brilliant. They should be more efficient than a big sparsely populated rural area. That's going to obviously have more pipe length and so on, and probably lots of smaller treatment plants compared to a big population. Anyhow, they have had Wix do a mock economic assessment of the Watercare business, and Wix set them a target of an annual savings target of 4.4%, so far higher than the government is assuming. And the Watercare board, in their wisdom, have accepted that. So their work, they haven't delivered it yet. It's early days. It was only 6 months ago that this was accepted. The other thing we've done, Andy is our finance man, he has looked at some of the sensitivities around the Wix model. So we've assumed, for example, if you didn't have to, if you, instead of the investment they assumed, half it, instead of the level of savings they assumed, half it, and instead of the 250% debt to income, double it. And it still comes out in a strong, with a strong case for reform. Just important to, we have tested some of those sensitivities. And I guess the question people will ask is 45% achievable? We don't know. Is significant improvement achievable with bigger entities? Yes. We have 67 small entities delivering the service now. We don't have a standard operating model. We have low levels of maturity in the ICT space that could be significantly improved.
Excuse me, Kevin.
Yep.
Ash here. Hey, we've just got a councillor's just got a question as we go,
Yep.
if that's okay. Neil, over to you, Neil.
Yeah. Good afternoon, Kevin.
Hi, Neil.
It's probably for Andy regarding water care. There, I see. You've put them up as quite a good sort of model at the moment, and Wicks have too. But I see this year their water charges are going up by 7.5%, and then they go up by 9% for the next 5 years until 2029. So if I work out $1,000 goes to 1,075, add on another 100 goes to 1,200, goes to 1,300, goes to 1,400, goes to 1,800 by 2029.
Yeah.
And then the IGCs are going up by 8% or 12% as well. So how can we think that big is better when our big neighbour who gets it easy is going to go up by nearly 50% in the next 8 years?
Yeah. Do you want to have a go at that?
I can see why they can say that they can save 4%, because they're saving 4% on a 9% increase.
Yeah. I think the reality is that for them, Neil, is they're facing the same challenges that the rest of the sector is facing,
Exactly.
Around service levels.
Yes.
And so, look, I suppose the baseline there is it's a moving baseline, isn't it? Because you've got a moving baseline of service level and performance. And so when they say 4% efficiency savings, it's 4% efficiency savings on what? Absolutely accept that. I suppose we've got to accept it at face value when they say that, I suppose, on the basis that it's 4% less than it would have been if if they didn't make the efficiency savings, then it would have even been higher, that cost. But look, that I've seen that as well, and I think that when you go and look across the sector, even in entity B, we've got anywhere between 50 and 150% increases in costs across the next 10 years, for councils in entity B, and so I think that they're facing the same challenge.
Yeah, I was just going to add to it, Neil. Look, when I look at the DIA dashboard and I see a price today of X, and then a price for the council without reform of 7X, and a price under reform of 3/4 X, I look at that rather skeptically. I think in reality here, the scale does make a difference. It can make a difference, but you're going to have to pay more with reform or without reform. The issue is how much more.
Yeah,
I think that's my view. I think the idea that bills will go down, I find that pretty hard to comprehend.
Yeah, we'll carry on with the rest of your slides, but when you put up water care, I just want other councillors who don't know to know that they've got
challenges. Absolutely.
They signalled 3 months ago that they've got major increases coming up.
Yeah.
And that's even before the Waikato Regional Council was kind enough to give them more water out of our river. Yeah. I might add. Yeah.
Just looking at some of the numbers and actually picking up on this, this is for the entity B area. So this is a sobering facts, Ghana wine glass, and it's half full. But the one at the number 12, 14 billion, that's the asset replacement value of Three Waters across entity B. 3 billion is the amount of debt the entity B councils will have in 2031 if they deliver everything to plan. 5.5 billion is the amount that the 22 councils in the area are planning to invest. So like Watercare, councils across the Waikato and the Bay and Taranaki and the Upper Manawatu have got a major increase in investment over the period. And that flows through to rates increases, which are significant over the period. And it means debt to income is going up across the entity area. And if you look then at debt to income, if you didn't have Three Waters, it's much healthier. It's much healthier across the entity area. 20% to 50% is the level of underfunding of renewals. Now that's not Wicks numbers, that's council's own numbers. So on average across the entity area, it's 20%, but for stormwater, it's around 50%. So there's a particular challenge in the stormwater area. Forget about the harmonisation. We already have a bit of a postcode lottery in the NDB area. The lowest water cost per household is around $720, which is a small rural authority in the Bay of Plenty, and the highest is more than 3.5 times that in the Waikato area. It's definitely not Matamata-Piako, by the way. But there's quite a big variation already, and it's important to understand that. 26% is the number of people who are drinking municipal water that's not compliant with the Ministry of Health standards. Now, in fairness, a fair number of that non-compliance is around testing and monitoring.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, with a new regulator who's going to be a lot more rigorous, that needs to be fixed quickly. And I know that's an issue here, and I know that there are plans in place to address the issues. 8% is the non-compliance in the private supply area that is currently registered. And it's important to understand that, so that's really small. Now, there aren't that many private supplies that are currently registered in the NDB area. It's under 100, and we've probably got 15 to 20,000. You know, we don't know how many they are. The important thing to recognize here, though, is, and this is not to do with the amalgamation, it's to do with the new regulation for fresh water. If you're not part of reform and you've got failures in private supplies, you're the default provider. So there's risk there, and it's over something we don't actually understand that well. Whereas if you're part of the reform, it's the water service entity's problem, and it's risk, not yours. Just important to understand that. And 51 is the average age of the workforce. We've got about 600 staff who work in the water space, employed by the 22 councils across the area. So I just wanted to give you a bit of a feel for that, and then begin to dip into what does it look at Matamata, what does it look like for your council. So 290 million is the asset replacement value. 50 million is the debt peaking, which comes down to 41 million in 2031 if you deliver everything according to plan. We all know you often have a bit of slippage in capital programs, as you know. 114 million is the Plan 3 Waters investment over the 10-year period. That's a big number, and that leads through to some significant increases in 3 Waters rates. And your debt to income is peaking at 225%. That's actually much lower than the average, and we'll come on to that later. But nevertheless, that's significant, isn't it? It's starting to increase. And your debt to income without 3 Waters is only 115%. So from a purely financial perspective, there's a lot more headroom without 3 Waters if it does transfer to a new entity. On depreciation funding, you're a strong performer. You're funding it over 100%. That's really good and something to be proud of, and something the regulator will look at. On average across the entity area, it's about 80%, as I said earlier. And your rates are around average at $1,400 per household. So that's, I think, you know, there's some really good metrics that come out of here, which you should be proud of. Challenging areas, drinking water compliance. We know the team are working on this, and we'll cover more of this later. And this is something that is getting urgent attention because the regulator is starting to gear up. There are challenges in the private supply schemes as well in the area, but there's a whole load of them that we just don't know about out there under the new. Now, of course, I've been talking about numbers, and I've been talking about pipes and plants, but we've got to remember this is really about people. This is a sketch of Moses on the Mount saying to God, these 10 commandments are fine, but what's in it for me? So I think about some of the people issues here. With the average water worker is 50-something water worker, probably hasn't gone through a lot of change in the last 10 years, but is facing a lot of change in the next 2 to 3 years. And I think one of the big questions they will ask themselves is, will I stay or will I go? And that's something we should be concerned about because we need them to stay. The support services worker, probably in his or her 30s or 40s, when water leaves, they become, it's a terrible term, a stranded asset, a stranded overhead rather, in the system. Will I be made redundant is one of the concerns there. The councillor who spends a lot of his or her time on Three Waters constituency issues. What will I do when Three Waters, if it moves over to a new entity? The HAPU chair who is passionate about fresh water quality. If there's a problem, she knows where she can get in touch with Mayor Ash. What happens if there's a big new entity and you've got to travel 60 miles or whatever to go and see people about it? So these are some of the people issues we really need to understand. And that's why we've been saying it's really important. Yes, the numbers, the finance and funding is going to be an important dimension, but it's not everything. Think about some of those other impacts. And there will be some upsides and there'll be some downsides. And those upsides and downsides will be different for each council. And really the purpose of today is to begin to tease some of those out. So looking at the community well-being, the social and economic well-being, looking at the people issues about the people who are employed at Matamata-Piako in water and in support services for water, but also the wider supply community in the region. And then thinking obviously about the service and environment issues around drinking water, wastewater, stormwater being absolutely critical. And without further ado, I'll pass you on to Andy, who will unpack the detail of the balanced scorecard and then look at how it's been applied to Matamata-Piako.
Loving those pictures, Kevin. You're an artist, mate.
We keep telling him he's in the wrong job, Mirash. I'm going to start by just running through, I suppose, some high level observations. Kevin's touched on a few of them already, and then drop in and talk a little bit more about the findings from the balanced scorecard exercise that we've worked through, and just dropping into that a fraction more. So when we, and I suppose it's probably 2.5, 3 months ago now, when all the stuff was coming out from the DIA about here's all these numbers and it's going to be this much and that much, we were starting to think about how we could provide a level of perspective or a model, if you like, that a framework, what do you want to call it, that would provide a level of perspective about some of the other things that councillors will find important as they work through building their views, and how did we sort of, I suppose, work through that. So we sort of identified on both perspectives, from the as things are now and as things may be under reform, what are the pros and cons, opportunities, risks, etc. So we came up with this framework which splits it into 4 quadrants. We thought a little bit about whether we would use the 4 well-beings, but it didn't quite fit. So we came up with this sort of this structure where you've got 4 quadrants, and sitting under those, there's a number of different areas that sit under each quadrant, as you saw in the diagram. And then under each of those 4 quadrants, there's those 14 considerations, and we go through and assess that with working with your officers. Some of them are database, based on data and financial information. Some of them are more subjective, but covering off on all those areas. And the idea being that the outcome of that we give to you, and you can have a look at it and build that into your understanding and your feedback to LG&Z, in addition to those items that were discussed at the Taupohui, Mirash, and build some more specific things as they might impact out of your localised area. And probably to get the creative juices going in terms of thinking and going, okay, so what have we missed, and what else is important in terms of your view. So if you look at what we've found at a general level, and I'll start at a sort of high level and then specifically show you how that's reflected the scorecard. In terms of what's going well, really strong focus on supporting growth and how responsive you can be to growth, and the impact that has favourably on your processing and agribusiness industries, which are quite a staple of your community. We'll talk a little bit about that from a risk perspective later. Sound financials and pretty modest debt when you compare that to others. You're fully funding your depreciation, as Kevin said before, which is also a positive. On the risk side, there's a little bit of rises in both debt and rates as a response to your investment requirements through the plan. Good performer on wastewater, and that's quite an issue in some other areas. So that's a positive. And pretty positive on iwi too, in terms of your partnerships that you've got in place, and your fledgling, I suppose, co-governance, if you like, in terms of the Hauraki Golf Forum, and in recognition for further change. So there's some really good. So what's challenging? I'll whip through these pretty quickly because you probably know them all yourself. Drinking water compliance, that's the biggest challenge, I think, in terms of when you look at that. There's some work going on to address that in the LTP, which is positive. Reasonably large number of private supplies, which we do see as a risk, as Kevin said. And I think the point there, though, is that's going to largely be dealt with by regulation rather than reform first, we think. So it'll be a regulatory issue, and then reform will respond to that in due course, rather than reform dealing with that specifically. It's interesting, just as an aside, that issue sort of reared its head in some of our more predominantly rural and remote communities, and how that's going to work with reform. But I think that, as we've seen, because of the large number of private suppliers, it's probably sort of been it's going to be addressed more regulation than reform from reform itself. And probably the issue around standards of discharges to waterways are likely to rise, and with your discharges to waterways, that's probably a challenge for you moving forward, which is partly covered in your LTP, but not entirely. Then next, just the challenge around future growth. If growth continues, at the moment you're managing that growth in the context of your LTP, but if that requirement continues to grow, future challenge of managing growth, investment requirements against potentially your renewal ones, and the trade-off there. And the fact that that's increased costs is leading to a bit of uplift in rates, and will start to stretch your balance sheet out in due course.
Hey, Andy, just on that, if I can just interrupt, sorry.
Sure.
So when you're like this leading to the rate increases and start to stretch the council balance sheet, but surely under the reform, and if it goes over to a new entity, and like I'd be interested. I know the DIA have given us the 30-year projection of say $1,200 a year in year 30, as opposed to $4,900 a year if we opt out.
Yeah.
But you can't tell me if they're talking about investing 185 billion into it and putting on an extra 9,000 workers in the water industry space on top of the 4,600 or 4,900 we already have. I'd be interested in seeing, our residents may notice a rate increase for the waters, part of their bill and their rates, but under a new entity, there's no way they'll be charging less than $1,200 in year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, heading up to the 30-year mark. There's no way.
And I think the real challenge when you go and look at those numbers, Ash, and see what they've done is they use a totally different model, and so when they and I'll try and explain this as without getting into the techie stuff of their model, because it's very complicated. Basically when you look at a council side, we build up our costs, go and say, how much does it cost, allow for some depreciation, and that's what we're going to rate, right? So So when you go and look at what they do, they take an opportunity where at least in the early years, they really heavily gear the organisation. So they use debt capacity. So it's a totally different model. They don't go bottom up. What's your cost? What are we going to charge? And so the thinking is that allows them to be able to buy some time to deliver the efficiency savings that they plan to deliver without imposting on rates costs in the early years as they ramp up that investment. Goes back to, so the key driver then becomes, back to Kevin's point, is can they achieve the efficiencies that they're saying they're going to do and that they're going to achieve in due course, and because that's going to be the driver of the end game. They can manage it in the interim because they've got debt capacity of 600 or 700% debt to income, using slightly different metrics, but that's what it equates to. So it does come back in the end to whether they're going to deliver the efficiencies in the longer term, because they will be able to manage the rate levels, I think, in the shorter term by using a different sort of debt gearing process than what we use in councils.
Just to add to what Andy said, Ash, I went through an amalgamation in the UK, 7 organisations coming into one. The reality was, during the transition in the first few years, the costs went up because you had you made efficiency. Some staff were made redundant. There was investment in new IT and all of that, so the costs went up. And then the savings, generally, you had to invest before you got them. So they would generally come in between years 3 and 8 of the new entity being into being. But what's happening here is they're smoothing it all with debt funding over a longer period. Do you know what I mean? So I don't think you would get big increases in charges early on, because it would be smoothed over a long period. It is a different way of operating, but there is a model there that we need to understand about what happens to the investments, the costs and savings, and how is that being smoothed, which we don't have visibility of at the moment.
Yeah, well, we've just seen the BBC article from a couple of weeks ago on the Wix model, and we can see how they saved the 50%.
So Kevin, that's a good point. But the first thing Scottish Water did was they laid off 2,500 staff.
Yeah.
That was the first thing they did, and then they've re-employed them all in other positions over time. But I can understand that's going to happen with ours, and that's part and parcel what's going to happen. But for me, the concern is they can borrow the money, all the money they like, but if we haven't got the labour or the supply chain to build it, what's the point of borrowing all this money when you can't build anything?
Yeah. Look, I think there is a big issue about deliverability. Even now, without reform,
Exactly.
we've got a 50% increase in investment across the Waikato and Bay of Plenty area, for example. Can all of that be delivered? And the second issue I would say is before we get on to recruiting new people, hang on to the ones we've already got.
Yeah, because some of those people won't be bothered; they'll just leave. Yeah, but I think that's the point. Is it's no good being able to borrow 100 billion if you haven't got anybody to do the work.
Yeah. No, agree. There's a challenge there. Yeah.
So,
Andy.
Yeah. Just before I continue, Marius, the only other thing I'd say about that, and I'm not for a minute trying to justify the process that Wix have taken around those numbers, because we've all got questions around the assumptions that they've made. But the other thing to think about in terms of how they'll manage those rates in the early years is the role of the economic regulator, which we haven't really had before, and that'll do 2 things. That'll make people fund depreciation, the effectively, the sort of get rid of some of the, I suppose, variable behaviour that we have that's still considered financially prudent under the current regulations, but also manage manage that rating side and how much impost there will be on councils, on ratepayers, through those initial years. That doesn't address the issue about those other issues that you guys have just reflected on, though. So of reform, Kevin's talked mainly about these. I won't go into them in too much detail. We've talked a little bit about the additional debt headroom, the scale and efficiencies area, and increase debt capacity. And probably I think the one which we're all reflecting on is the proposed rapid improvement in drinking water compliance and stormwater, and the question there is whether, as you say, is that question of resourcing and resource availability. But then on the other side of the coin, it does create some significant challenges in terms of community and the criticality of continual delivery and of placemaking outcomes, and so that's localized decision making, and how the different local decision making priorities are going to be reflected in the new entity planning, and that ensuring that there's a way that the local community aspirations drive what the water entities do, not the other way around, which is pretty fundamental. And as we work through this, I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then I suppose for some councils, there's a question about post-reform, whether the council will have sufficient scale to provide effective emergency response and fulfill broader community obligations. Maybe a little bit less of an issue for you, but for some of the rural councils and smaller councils, they see that as a big challenge. And then, as Kevin talked about, the uncertainty of the impact on support staff under reform, and then more generally, as we sort of alluded to before, the impact on local supply chain, local influence, and those local investment priorities. Just gloss over that. I just want to say that in terms of our analysis, we haven't really taken into account the Better Off grant from government. We haven't built that in, so that's in addition to anything that we've worked through at the moment. And then just a couple of other points there around the stranded overheads funding, which there's some decision making yet to be made about, and the proposed investment. If we go into what does that mean at an issue level, we've boiled that down into this little table, and what this does is it reflects the fact that when we've worked through with your officers and done the scoring, we've used a sort of red, amber, green assessment basis. So red meaning something's worse or there's significant risk, and green meaning that that something's an opportunity or it's good or favourable. So and we used that scoring when we went through all of the 55 criteria. So this is effectively a summary of that, recognising that in between that current and reform pictures, there's your LTP. So if we look at the issues that we've identified here by breaking down the information that came out of the assessment without going and looking at it in detail, that's strong on wastewater, but your challenges in drinking water, you're fixing some of that through the LTP, but regulations sort of going to lift the bar and get that sorted. The issue around private supplies that we've talked about, that you're handing that issue effectively over to the new water service entity under reform. The life cycle costing challenges that will exist for drinking water going forward, and the issues around ability to sustainably invest in the community with that increasing reliance on development contributions. The next two are really ones where it goes the other way, where it's reform isn't all roses or rainbows and unicorns or whatever you want to call it. That under that issue, we're recognising that localised response to industry growth and development needs as the key area where we see a big risk for you under reform. And if we were looking and pulling out those areas from the information that your officers provide us, that would be a key area that you'd be wanting to make sure that there is pretty clear at least principles about how those issues were going to be coped with through reform. And the second one there, and that around ability to control local wellbeing is about the integration of community outcomes, and that there might be more investment. On the other side, there might be more investment, but how responsible the new entity actually be to those community concerns.
The important ones.
Yeah, absolutely, Ash. Absolutely. So when we think about how the broader outcome of the balanced scorecard exercise, it's then going and saying, so for those ones that are on the, that are yellow or amber on that score there, what specific actions need to be brought through or fed back to the DIA to address those issues, plus any other ones that you think about. So just onto that next sheet, and I'm going to drop down to a few of the areas and talk a little bit about it as we move forward. So, and at the moment, if you look at it, where you end up with a reasonably neutral picture as you are at the moment. So, you're actually pretty good. And if I look at that picture with other councils that we've worked through, when I get to the without reform in 10 years, so that's your LTP picture in the middle there, most councils have a level of amber in that. They're still not getting there. So you're not too bad, but you do see some improvement overall in those areas. And I'll just jump through into the next slide to show you how that all breaks down. So what this graph is showing is in those groups of bars, we're looking at the first group of bars is service, the next is finance and funding, then social and community and economic wellbeing and resourcing. So what it's showing is that in service, you can make a reasonably significant, you're getting halfway there in terms of your service improvement with your LTP, but it looks like there's more opportunity with reform. Now, the finance one's really interesting because finance actually doesn't show that bigger uplift overall between the two scenarios, right? So it doesn't say that reform is a whole lot better. I'll tell you, I'm going to drop into that and tell you why in a minute. The others show a sort of a gradual trend. If you just drop down, I just want to explain probably if you go into, if we'll just look at service first. And just as an example, so if what service is reflecting in that number one, this is then dropping down to the next level and saying, where are you at on drinking water, wastewater, stormwater and asset management? So if you look at wastewater in the second bunch of columns, between the middle column, which is your LTP, and reform, not a very big gap. So so there's not a lot of benefit. If you look at water in the first grouping, your performance is pretty poor now, and that's probably reflecting your compliance issues. Big jump up with your LTP, but another little bit of a change when you come and look at that increase. In the asset management space, we're probably the biggest changes is probably in opportunities in your asset management and infrastructure planning space. That's what's been identified by the officers in that service as a change in that service one. It's the fourth group of graphs. If you jump down and we'll just go and look at finance, Kevin, just as one more. I just wanted to show why this is a little bit all over the place, but I think this reflects the value of the exercise, and that when you actually go through, it's not all one-way traffic, because in this we're saying that there's a little bit of advantage around debt capacity and balance sheet, but offsetting that is in that first grouping is you're heavily reliant on development contributions. And there's a bit of a concern that we have at the moment under reform that the DIA hasn't yet signalled how development contributions or the equivalent of will be managed under reform. And at the moment, that mechanism is fundamental to being able to deliver the infrastructure to support growth. So that's playing down the reform scenario and why those are quite even. And then if you go right to the other end, there's some, and you go and look at the post-reform council viability one, that gets worse under reform. Okay, and that's reflecting on some of those on some challenges in that space, and we see a similar trend. I think if you go through and look at some of the other things that are more socially sort of orientated in terms of delivery and social aspects. So I see a few things coming through on the chat. So I'm sure you've got a whole lot of questions or queries or comments or discussions. So I might leave it there for now and leave it to you to open up for questions, Mirash.